41 municipalities, Senator J.D. Vance declared, his sentence already in motion as the broadcast lenses focused squarely on his face. His vocal tone was intentionally low and heavily measured. He continued, emphasizing that 41 distinct American communities had been explicitly assured that this federal initiative would fortify them. They were promised that the authorities in Washington would completely underwrite the transitional costs, that their public school systems would receive massive support, and that their local concerns would be prioritized and heard long before a single refugee placement occurred within their borders. Locking his eyes across the vast hearing table at Representative Ilhan Omar, he stated firmly that these 41 municipalities had genuinely trusted those political guarantees. Representative, they are watching this hearing right now, and they would like to know what happened, he observed. This gathering represented the ultimate oversight hearing before the Senate Homeland Security Subcommittee was scheduled to cast a decisive vote on the reauthorization of the Federal Refugee Community Placement Initiative, FRCPI. This controversial program had rapidly accelerated the relocation of refugee families into 41 mid-sized American towns, doing so while explicitly guaranteeing these municipalities everything required for success: fully funded educational integration specialists, comprehensive subsidized housing relief, targeted employment readiness programs, and strictly mandated community dialogues before a single individual was settled. Representative Omar was the prominent co-author of the original enabling legislation in the House. She had aggressively championed the initiative on the congressional floor, heavily promoted its virtues during countless press conferences, and directly promised the host towns that they would emerge, using her exact vocabulary: stronger, not strained. The critical reauthorization vote was looming in a mere 72 hours. Should the measure pass, those 41 municipalities would be subjected to a second wave of placements. Should it fail, they would finally receive much-needed relief. Sitting poised behind the witness desk, Omar maintained a composed exterior. She responded to the opening remarks with a deeply practiced, welcoming warmth, thanking the senator for the platform to testify. She framed the FRCPI as the ultimate reflection of American ideals, a nation graciously welcoming families fleeing imminent peril, heavily investing in local neighborhoods, and collaboratively building a brighter future. Folding her hands together, she stated proudly that she stood by her previous declarations on the House floor. She affirmed that the initiative was designed to make receiving towns stronger, not strained, arguing that reauthorization was vital, not because the inaugural year was entirely flawless, but because the government had a moral obligation to complete the mission it had begun. Vance nodded slowly, acknowledging her defense. He stated his appreciation for her perspective and recognized her initial care for these communities, which was why she had championed the bill in the first place. He then paused, letting the collegial atmosphere dissipate. He revealed that over the preceding 2 months, he had personally traveled to all 3 of the Ohio municipalities designated as receiving zones: Dayton, Springfield, and Zanesville. He vividly described sitting inside elementary school cafeterias that were structurally designed to accommodate 400 children, yet were now desperately trying to serve nearly 700 students. He recounted sobering discussions with local educators who had not received a salary increase in 3 years but whose daily classroom populations had doubled instantaneously. He spoke of working-class families who watched their property tax bills surge drastically to cover municipal costs that the federal government had explicitly promised to finance. Looking up from his detailed notes, Vance asked a direct question. "Representative Omar, when was the last time you visited any of the 41 receiving cities?" Her response arrived a fraction of a second slower than her previous, highly rehearsed remarks. She stated she had maintained tight communication with the program's administrative directors and had received continuous briefings regarding implementation progress across the various sites. Crucially, she did not provide a specific date. She did not name a single municipality. Vance chose not to aggressively highlight the omission. He simply allowed the glaring non-answer to hang heavily in the silent chamber. He then reminded her that those 41 locales had serious questions, noting that millions of American families were actively living through the agonizing consequences of this initiative every single day. They were not present in the ornate Washington hearing room. They were sitting at home, watching the broadcast, and desperately waiting for an authority figure to explain how the solemn promises made to them had evaporated. Reaching to his right, Vance pulled forward a massive, imposing folder lined with a cascade of color-coded tabs running down its edge. He opened it to the first section and issued a warning to the public tuning in. If they sensed the trajectory of this interrogation They needed to stay glued to their screens because the ensuing 30 minutes would unfold in a manner nobody in the political establishment had predicted. He urged viewers to subscribe and share, ensuring they did not miss a single moment. I want to make sure we get through everything today because the vote is Thursday, and I think you are going to want to address what is in here before then, Vance stated clearly. Behind Omar, her chief of staff could be seen leaning forward anxiously, eyes tracking the unusually thick binder. Vance initiated his inquiry with a single foundational metric. He asked for the FRCPI's total appropriated financial budget for its first year. Omar answered swiftly and without hesitation. $847 million. She delivered the figure smoothly, the way a politician recites a statistic they have memorized and repeated across 100 different interviews. Vance confirmed the number of participating cities was 41. Applying basic arithmetic, Vance suggested that an even distribution would have yielded approximately $20.6 million in direct federal support for each municipality, asking if that was a reasonable baseline to operate from. Omar immediately contested the premise, explaining that the financial distribution models were never designed to be perfectly symmetrical. Rather, the capital allocations were carefully scaled according to local population densities, the strength of pre-existing municipal infrastructure, and the projected volume of refugee placements for each specific zone. I understand, Vance replied calmly, refusing to be drawn into a debate about modeling. Let me ask it differently. He began reading directly from the colored tabs in his folder, outlining the catastrophic financial shortfalls experienced by the 3 Ohio cities. Zanesville was projected to receive $14.2 million from the federal government, but ultimately received only $6.1 million, less than half of the promised amount. Springfield was projected to receive $17.8 million, but actually received a mere $9.3 million. Dayton was projected to receive $22.5 million, but took in only $11.9 million. Setting the document down, Vance stared at the witness. "Representative, these are not rounding errors," he stated firmly. "Where did the difference go?" Omar attempted to explain the mechanics of federal funding pipelines, noting that capital inevitably incurs administrative and operational costs at various bureaucratic levels before reaching the municipal level. When Vance pressed her to estimate the percentage of funds lost to this administrative overhead, she offered a figure of approximately 12%. Vance didn't argue. He simply read the actual verified number from a preliminary Government Accountability Office (GAO) assessment. 23%, nearly double her estimated projection. He did not editorialize or gloat. He plainly read her estimate, juxtaposed it with the grim reality, and methodically moved to the next tab in his folder. By moving on, Vance deliberately pulled on a thread that threatened to unravel the entire narrative of the program's success. If the promised funding had bled out in the federal pipeline and failed to reach the local municipalities, he reasoned, what happened to the essential personnel? "I want to know about the school integration specialists," Vance demanded. These specialists were supposed to be hired locally utilizing the promised federal grants. If the funds did not arrive, were the specialists hired? Omar deflected, citing complex macroeconomic factors. She blamed a highly competitive national labor market and severely compressed operational timelines for the program's widespread hiring challenges. Once again, Vance bypassed the rhetoric and delivered the crushing numerical reality straight from the GAO assessment. 7. Across 41 American cities tasked with integrating over 30,000 brand new students into local school districts, the federal government had successfully deployed a grand total of 7 integration specialists. Vance let the microscopic number echo in the room. He reminded her of her triumphant speech on the House floor where she had declared there would be a specialist for every receiving district. "There are 41 districts. There are 7 specialists," he stated. He didn't need to elaborate on the math. Every single person watching the broadcast did the calculations in their heads. He then painted the grim domino effect of this failure. Because the money vanished, the experts were never hired. Because the experts were absent, the existing, already overworked local teachers were forced to absorb the entirety of the shockwave. These educators were left to manage the influx of new students, navigate profound language barriers without translators, and control classrooms that had dangerously ballooned from 25 children to 40. Furthermore, school cafeterias built for 400 were suddenly attempting to feed nearly 700 students. Vance articulated that this wasn't a singular, isolated failure. It was a catastrophic chain reaction, and every single broken link traced directly back to the hollow promises made in Washington that were not kept across those 41 cities. Local property taxes across the municipalities skyrocketed to bridge the financial gaps the federal government had sworn to cover. In Zanesville, the municipal government was forced to spend more money covering FRCPI financial shortfalls than it spent on its entire annual parks and recreation budget. The gap between Washington's promise and its actual delivery cost the city more than the combined maintenance of every playground, baseball diamond, and public swimming pool in the district. Fathers who volunteered to coach youth soccer were forced to watch as the city abandoned field maintenance. Working-class families who had saved for 3 decades to purchase homes watched in horror as their tax burdens surged to finance an initiative they had zero say in accepting. These were not budget line items, Vance stressed. These were the tangible lives of millions of American citizens who had trusted their government to keep its word. Omar vehemently pushed back against the narrative. She cited various historical federal programs, many with deep bipartisan support, that had also suffered through notoriously difficult inaugural years. While her historical context was factually accurate, Vance possessed zero interest in entertaining analogies. He ruthlessly dragged the conversation back to the budget. He held up a press release issued by Omar's own office just 7 months prior, which triumphantly declared that the FRCPI had successfully delivered $593 million in direct community support. Vance then revealed the results of the GAO's comprehensive survey of all 41 participating municipalities. The actual verified total those cities reported receiving was a mere $311 million. He allowed the staggering $282 million discrepancy to suffocate the room. He coldly observed that the missing capital, the difference between her public relations victory lap and the reality faced by the cities, could have entirely funded every single elementary school in Zanesville for 6 consecutive years. Crucially, Vance did not explicitly ask where the money had vanished. He didn't have to. He expertly allowed the sinister question to form organically in the minds of every viewer watching the broadcast. "I want to come back to that gap," Vance stated, seamlessly pivoting the interrogation. "But first, I want to ask about community consultation." Sensing the shifting tides, Omar visibly altered her posture, shifting in her chair. When she spoke next, her vocal frequency had dropped. It was lower, intensely deliberate, and laced with defiance. She was done being questioned. Looking directly straight at Vance, she stated she wanted to address something directly. She leaned aggressively forward over the witness table. While claiming to respect his sudden concern for the citizens of Ohio communities, she demanded to ask him a question. Where was this deep concern, she asked, when the manufacturing factories in Zanesville shuttered their doors forever? Where was this passion when the opioid epidemic ravaged and hollowed out those exact same neighborhoods? When the storefronts on Main Street went dark and local families were tragically burying their addicted children, did the senator convene a high-profile congressional hearing for them? Without blinking, she accused Vance of blatant political opportunism. She argued that these communities had been struggling, underfunded, overlooked, and treated as politically invisible long before the FRCPI was ever conceived. She posited that Vance had only found these struggling towns now because there was a vulnerable federal program to attack, a committee hearing room to fill, and national television cameras to perform for. Turning her gaze to the rest of the committee members, she proudly declared that she had dedicated her entire professional career to fighting for marginalized, struggling communities, whereas the senator from Ohio had seemingly only discovered his constituents last month. The counterattack landed with brutal force. Behind Vance, a staffer nervously shifted their weight. 2 fellow senators on the dais awkwardly looked down at their scattered papers. Up in the viewing gallery, the room tilted perceptibly. Even viewers who had tuned in fully expecting Vance to dominate the representative felt an uncomfortable realization settle over them. The undeniable possibility that she might be right. Omar had successfully seized the momentum, and she pressed it. Her voice rose in volume and intensity with the kind of moral certainty that had made her a formidable force on cable news networks for years. And then she overextended. She declared that she deeply understood the fear harbored by the people who opposed her program. "But I did not come to Congress to govern by fear," she proclaimed. "I came to do what is right, even when it is not popular in certain communities." Certain communities. She intended the phrase as a critique of fear-driven politics. That is what she meant. But that is not what millions of Americans heard. What they heard was a woman who had never visited their overcrowded schools, never answered their desperate letters, and never read the reports about their failing cities, standing under oath and calling their lived experience fear. The families who watched their property taxes rise, the parents whose children came home from chaotic classrooms, and the taxpayers who funded a program that delivered less than half of what it promised, she just called all of them afraid. She had just reduced everything they had lived through to a dismissive word that meant their objections did not count. In living rooms across America, in every one of those 41 cities and every town that looked like them, people heard certain communities and understood exactly what it meant. She was not talking about policy, she was talking about them. Vance did not respond immediately, and this time, the silence was not strategic. Omar's first blow regarding Zanesville and the opioid crisis had genuinely landed. The audience could see it in his posture. He wasn't performing calm, he was actively choosing his response. "Representative, you are right," Vance finally conceded, causing the room to completely still. He openly admitted that he was right that he had not been present in Zanesville during the opioid crisis. Expressing deep regret for his absence, he acknowledged he could not change the fact that he had found these communities late. He paused. "But I am here now," he stated, his voice finding its floor. "I am asking the questions now, and I am asking you." He expertly absorbed the blow by conceding part of it, and in conceding, he entirely stripped it of its ongoing power. He admitted his profound imperfection and lateness, which made her active absence look infinitely worse. He reminded her that the citizens of those 41 cities were not waiting for him. They were waiting for her. She was the architect who told them they would be stronger. She was the authority figure they had desperately written to. Glancing back at his imposing folder, he delivered a crushing timeline. In 14 agonizing months, while their letters sat unread and unanswered in her legislative office, Omar had made 11 separate appearances on cable news networks, telling the entire country the program was working flawlessly. Omar attempted to frantically reframe her media advocacy, arguing it was a necessary component of fighting for a program under severe political attack. But the energy in the room had irrevocably shifted against her. She was explaining now, not attacking. If you lived in one of those certain communities she just mentioned, you were urged to share this video right now, because she just told millions of Americans under oath exactly what she thinks about the places they call home. Signaling a shift, Vance announced he was ready to move to the topic of community consultation, the promise he stated he was saving. But first, he made one observation. He reminded her of her proud declaration, "I came to do what is right," even when it is not popular in certain communities. Holding up his personal notepad, he showed the room he had written it down. "I want to come back to that phrase because I think it explains everything that went wrong with this program," he said softly. Omar's facial expression shifted in sudden, acute recognition. She realized instantly that her own line had been loaded into a weapon, and she could not take it back. Across the country, the broadcast was being watched in fragments and in full-on televisions in living rooms, on phones in break rooms, and on tablets propped against kitchen counters. In the 41 cities that had lived with this program's catastrophic consequences for 18 months, and in cities that simply looked at the list and saw themselves, people were transfixed. Retired teachers who had watched their schools buckle, taxpayers who felt their property statements like a physical punch, and parents who had received rehearsed, empty jargon at local school board meetings were all watching. They watched because someone was finally asking the hard questions they had been asking at kitchen tables for a year, and to see if the person who made the promises could actually answer them. Resetting his tone to a warmer, almost collegial frequency the way it sounded at the start, Vance asked Omar to detail the comprehensive community consultation process that the FRCPI had legally promised. Relieved to be back on familiar bureaucratic terrain, Omar straightened her posture. She described the framework with immense detail and pride. Community input sessions, local government coordination, impact assessments, and 90-day public comment windows mandated before any city received placements. "We built the strongest community engagement framework in the history of federal resettlement programs," she declared, clearly believing her own propaganda. Vance asked one simple question. How many of those 41 participating cities had completed the full consultation process before receiving their first placements? He read directly from the program's own internal quarterly compliance report, a document that Omar's legislative office was explicitly on the distribution list for. 0 out of 41. "You described the strongest framework in history, Representative. It was used 0 times," Vance observed. Omar immediately pushed back, insisting the engagement framework was correctly designed, but that implementation had been massively accelerated due to humanitarian urgency. She argued that because refugee families were in immediate danger, the timeline had to severely compress. In her defense, she uttered the exact sentence that changed the hearing forever. "We made the decision to prioritize placement speed because families were in danger. I was involved in those conversations, and I stand by that decision." She delivered it with moral certainty, completely oblivious to what she had just confessed. But Vance heard it. His pen stopped moving. He looked up from his notes, refusing to rush. He repeated her exact phrasing. "You said we made the decision. You said I was involved in those conversations." Opening his notes to a specific page, Vance reminded her that a mere 12 minutes prior in this very room, she had testified under oath that implementation decisions were handled exclusively at the agency level, and that her legislative office was not directly involved in program operations. He closed the notes with a definitive snap. "Which is true? Were you involved in the decision to skip the community consultation you promised 41 cities, or were you not?" He did not yell. He did not repeat the question. He simply allowed it to stand in the room like an impenetrable wall. Omar's legal counsel leaned forward in a panic, placing both hands flat on the table. A fellow senator on the committee involuntarily removed his reading glasses. Up in the gallery, a reporter excitedly underlined something twice. Omar's communications director closed her laptop and stared blankly at the back of her boss's head. The immense weight of the admissions settled across the country at the exact same time it settled in the room. Millions of Americans in those 41 cities realized the person who promised them a voice had just casually admitted to being part of the secret decision to take it away. Or she was not involved, and the massive program she built and defended on television 11 times operated with total autonomy without her knowledge. Either she made the call, or she did not know the call was made. For the families who were never consulted, never asked, and who woke up one morning to discover their community's fate had been chosen for them, neither answer was acceptable. Omar attempted to backtrack, claiming that her use of "we" was a broader reference to the legislative coalition, but her cadence had fundamentally fractured. She was frantically choosing words now instead of confidently deploying them. The unwavering confidence of her earlier counterattack was entirely gone. She knew exactly what she had said on the record, and she knew the congressional transcript had captured it. If you need to rewind that moment, you are not the only one. That single sentence just changed the entire hearing, and we are not done. Vance wrote down one final note. He chose not to press further. "I will let the record reflect both statements," he said coolly, turning to his last tab. "Representative Omar, I have one final area of questions. Then I will yield my time," Vance announced. He stated his desire to step back from the granular details. His voice had settled into something almost conversational, as though he had stopped trying to win the debate and was simply asking to uncover what was true. He asked her, in her own words, to define the primary purpose of the Federal Refugee Community Placement Initiative. Omar answered exactly as she had in 100 previous media interviews, and on 100 different stages. She spoke of welcoming families fleeing unimaginable danger, strengthening communities through diversity and targeted investment, and living up to America's highest moral values. She explicitly utilized the word strengthening, the exact same word from her floor speech, her press conferences, and her cable news appearances. It was the word that had become the program's ultimate promise and its brand. Vance nodded. "Is it your testimony today that FRCPI strengthened the communities that received placements?" he asked. With the reauthorization vote looming in less than 72 hours, Omar had no alternative. She said yes. She added caveats about imperfect implementation challenges, but insisted the long-term trajectory pointed towards stronger communities. She had to say yes. Reauthorization depended entirely on it. Vance then spoke exactly 5 sentences. One sentence for every broken promise. It was his lowest word count of the entire marathon hearing. 1. The funding did not reach the cities. 2. The specialists were never hired. 3. The job programs did not launch. 4. The consultation never happened. 5. And when the communities wrote to your office asking for help, no one answered. Each sentence was incredibly flat, declarative, and short. There were no dramatic adjectives and zero emotion. Just 5 methodical strikes delivered at a decreasing speed, each one landing with the accumulated weight of everything the preceding 30 minutes had built. Omar responded by delivering the most passionate, fiery speech of the entire hearing. She spoke eloquently about the moral arc of a great nation, about how imperfect implementation does not invalidate a righteous mission, and challenged the room to consider what kind of country turns its back on families fleeing war and persecution. She spoke continuously for over a minute without stopping. Every word was deeply felt, and every word was authentically believed too. And yet, not a single word addressed the 5 factual sentences Vance had just laid out. She was furiously arguing about what America should be. Vance had simply asked her to account for what she had actually done. When she finally finished, the massive room waited. Vance offered a 3-word reply, the absolute shortest he had spoken all day. "You did not answer." It wasn't an aggressive accusation, but a melancholy observation, said so quietly that the entire room physically leaned in to hear it. Then Vance opened his final tab. It contained his own handwritten personal notes from his visits to the 3 Ohio cities. He completely abandoned reading statistics. Instead, he read a raw account of what his own eyes had seen. He described third-grade classrooms where young children were forced to sit on the hard floor because there were not enough physical desks. He detailed a school cafeteria where lunch was forced into 3 exhausting shifts because the room could not hold everyone at once. He spoke of dedicated teachers who had not been given a single additional resource, yet were expected to magically teach 35 children who collectively spoke 11 different languages. He read it plainly, stripping away all political rhetoric and performance, and then his voice caught. It was barely a fracture, a micro-hesitation so small that most casual observers would have missed it. Except the microphone was extremely close, the chamber was dead silent, and millions of people were listening intently. He was speaking about the children specifically, the local students who had been reading at their appropriate grade level before the federal program arrived, and who were not anymore. He noted this wasn't happening because anyone deliberately failed them, but because the vital resources Washington promised never materialized, causing the entire local educational system to collapse under an artificial weight it was never built to carry. Vance looked down at his handwritten notes and took one deep breath. When his gaze returned to Omar, his eyes were incredibly steady. But the audience had heard the emotion. They understood the immense effort it cost him to maintain his composure. They recognized that his quiet stillness wasn't born of coldness. It was the intense restraint of a man who had personally witnessed what broken promises look like inside a third-grade classroom and was actively choosing not to let his righteous anger speak for him. Looking directly at Omar, Vance issued a final challenge. "Representative, I would like you to do something no one has asked you today. Repeat the promise you made to those communities when this program launched." He explicitly forbade her from reciting her abstract policy goals or grand vision. He demanded the specific verbatim words she had used at the press podium. "Say them again for every family in those 41 cities who is watching right now." Omar did not repeat the promise. She physically could not. To stare into a camera and utter the phrase "stronger, not strained," after the preceding hour of devastating revelations would be an unforgivable insult to every single community currently living the complete opposite reality. Instead, she began to construct a completely different sentence. She used cautious, heavily guarded language about continued commitment and learning from challenges. They were extremely careful words that sounded nothing like the triumphant guarantees she had made at the podium. Vance watched her desperately substitute the vocabulary of a politician for the promises of a leader when the cameras were new, and the host municipalities had not yet learned what it would ultimately cost them. "You kept the podium, Representative," Vance said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, almost gentle and profoundly sad. "You just forgot the promise." 9 devastating words. He closed his heavy binder, placed both of his hands flat on the wooden table, and did not move a single muscle. Omar offered absolutely no response. It wasn't because she refused, it was because there was simply nothing left to say that the room or the country would believe. Her legal team did not lean forward. No frantic notes were passed. Not a single staff member dared to move. What followed was 6 agonizingly long, uninterrupted seconds of pure silence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Across the entire country, in crowded living rooms, quiet break rooms, and busy kitchens, millions of Americans watched those 6 seconds tick by. The taxpayers whose hard-earned money mysteriously vanished into the massive gap between 593 million and 311 million watched. The frustrated parents whose children were sitting on crowded classroom floors watched. The residents of towns who were promised a democratic voice only to receive a unilateral mandate from someone else watched. For all of them, that 6-second silence was far from empty. It was dense and completely full. It was filled with every desperate letter that was never answered, every solemn promise that was casually broken, and every working family that was told, "You will be stronger," only to be abandoned to shoulder a massive weight that was never theirs to carry. "Mr. Chairman," Vance finally said, "I yield my remaining time." He did not add anything further or attempt to summarize his victory. The chairman politely thanked him, and the next senator was formally recognized. But absolutely everyone inside that room and everyone watching at home knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the hearing had functionally ended 30 seconds ago. When the committee chairman eventually offered Representative Omar the customary opportunity for a closing statement, she took it. However, her final remarks were composed and notably brief, clocking in at under half the length of her confident opening monologue. She retreated to safe, abstract talking points about fundamental American values, the massive amount of work still required, and the danger of allowing partisan political disagreements to undermine humanitarian commitments. But in Washington, the words omitted are often far louder than the words spoken. During her closing, she did not say strengthening communities. She did not say stronger, not strained. She completely avoided mentioning the 41 specific cities, the stack of unanswered letters, or the highly touted community consultation framework, CIRC, that was never once utilized. She carefully sidestepped any reference to the glaring $282 million gap between her press releases and the GAO audits. She systematically avoided every single word Vance had successfully transformed into a weapon, and in avoiding them, she inadvertently cemented their catastrophic weight into the record. The chairman formally closed the oversight hearing. The gavel came down heavily. What had just transpired inside Russell 385 was now permanently etched into the congressional record, forever searchable, forever quotable, exactly 72 hours before the critical reauthorization vote. Omar exited swiftly through a discreet side door, her staff forming a tight, protective circle around her. There was no triumphant press availability, no impromptu hallway interviews. Her communications director was already furiously barking into a cell phone as the heavy wooden door swung shut, desperately trying to construct a proactive statement to reframe the disaster before the brutal evening news cycle began. Omar marched directly past the waiting press pool without even turning her head. She was not entirely defeated, but she was rapidly recalibrating her survival strategy. She knew exactly what the viral clip would be. She knew certain communities would dominate every headline, and she knew "we made the decision" would be the cornerstone of the impending committee report. Vance exited the chamber calmly through the main public entrance. When an eager reporter asked if he was satisfied with the outcome of the showdown, he maintained the exact same even temperature he had displayed at the start of the hearing. There was no emotional spike, no victory lap. He noted mildly that Representative Omar had volunteered her time, that congressional oversight was simply how the system was designed to function, and that the impacted communities deserved solid answers before Thursday's vote. When pressed specifically about the devastating final exchange, he offered a simple reply: "The record speaks for itself." He then walked quietly toward the elevators. This spectacle was never orchestrated for the benefit of Washington insiders. It wasn't designed to entertain the partisan cable news panels, generate fodder for elite op-ed pages, or fuel the endless debates on the Sunday morning political talk shows that would undoubtedly spend the next 72 hours arguing about what it meant. It was held entirely for the millions of Americans who live in those 41 cities, and in every city that looks just like them. It was for the working-class families whose local taxes spiked while their civic services cratered. It was for the exhausted parents who watched helplessly as their children's educational foundations buckled under a massive weight that the federal government had sworn to carry, only to walk away. It was for the communities who were told, "You will be stronger," by a politician who never once bothered to return and check whether it was true. In just 72 hours, the committee would vote, and every single member of that committee knew that the citizens who had tuned into this hearing were the exact same people who would remember in November whether anyone in Washington actually listened. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and share it, because nobody on the Legacy News is going to tell this story the way it truly happened in that room. We are, and the only way we keep doing it is because you are here. This is your story, these are your communities, and somebody finally asked the questions you have been asking for years. The hearing concluded at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time. By 5 p.m., the clip was absolutely everywhere. It wasn't the full hearing, just 93 potent seconds. It started with Omar's longest, most passionate answer about the moral arc of a nation, an eloquent monologue that was believed but answered absolutely nothing Vance had asked. It then showed 3 words from Vance. You did not answer. It showed the request to repeat the promise, Omar's choice to use different words, the devastating kill shot, and the unedited silence. 93 seconds. It required absolutely no commentary. People shared the video the way citizens share things that validate what they have known for a long time, but had never actually heard spoken out loud in a room that mattered. In the 41 receiving cities, residents watched the footage and saw their daily lives perfectly reflected in the numbers. They saw their 11% property tax hikes, their overflowing schools devoid of new teachers, and their deteriorating public parks sacrificed to cover federal shortfalls that nobody had ever voted for. They didn't actually need a senator to inform them that the program had failed. They had been living inside the epicenter of that failure for 18 agonizing months. But hearing someone say it under oath, inside a wood-paneled room equipped with a gavel and a national broadcast camera that was profoundly different, that was the catharsis of seeing someone finally standing in a place of immense authority, loudly saying what millions of families had been whispering at their kitchen tables for over a year. The clip did not go viral because it contained a shocking revelation. It went viral precisely because it was not shocking at all. Every single person who watched it already knew the grim reality. They knew about the money that did not come, the schools that buckled, the desperate letters that were never answered, and the mandatory consultation that never happened. They knew that the grand promises had dissolved the exact moment the press podium was packed up and the national cameras moved on. They had known this truth for a very long time. They had merely been waiting for someone inside that building, inside that city, inside that broken system to finally say it out loud. And in 72 hours, the committee would vote. For the very first time in 18 months, the citizens trapped inside those 41 struggling communities did not feel entirely invisible. They felt as though someone had looked directly into the camera lens, articulated the precise nightmare they had been thinking, feeling, and living with, and had not flinched. They felt like somebody had finally remembered they existed.